Hello everyone. This video is going to be a companion video to the last video that I posted about the vintage American-made bench vises. In that first video we looked at a Reed R series, we looked at a Holland, and we looked at a Colombian. And the vises are all taken apart and we looked at the design differences on them and about what makes them good and what could have been improved on them. And in that video I mentioned that in my opinion the Reed R series was overall the best general purpose bench vise that you could get. And that remains true, and it will remain true in this video. That for general purpose use, you can't go wrong with the Reed R series. That's the bottom line. I don't care. I got a Starrett vise sitting here that we're gonna look at. And so Starrett was made by Athol. And these Starrett vises are extremely sought after by collectors. And they're very expensive when you go to buy them. And it's a fantastic vise, but it ain't a Reed R series. Okay, let's just cut to the chase on that. And I'm going to show you why. And additionally, for today's video, we also have, in addition to the Athol-Starrett vise, we got a Charles Parker into the mix, right? Charles Parker made some fantastic bench vises. And this vise is 125 years old, and you know what? It's fantastic. Maybe better than the Starrett. And we're going to take a look and see why. I have a Wilton. And Wilton, if you watch any video on YouTube of Machinist, A-Bomb, Keith Rucker, I don't care who it is, they all have a Wilton Bullet vise sitting on the workbench somewhere in their shop. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is not only to do with the fact that it's a good looking vise. I mean, Wiltons are a great general purpose vise for light to moderate duty. As long as you're not doing something real heavy on it, you really can't go wrong with a Wilton Bullet vise. And also over here, just as a reminder of how good it is, I do have the 5-inch Reed R series vise. I got that broken down here so that we can kind of look at it and compare and contrast it to these other three. So today's video, we're going to have the Starrett, which was made by Athol-Starrett. We have the Charles Parker, we have a Wilton Bullet, and we have the Reed R. So let's take a look at each one of these vises, and let's discuss what's good on them, what could be improved on them. Looking forward to it. The first vise we're going to talk about is the Wilton Bullet. And Wilton was started in 1941 by a guy named Hugh Vogel. Now, Mr. Vogel moved to the USA from Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, he worked for a company called York. And York is the company that actually came up with the concept of this enclosed style of vise, and they pulled a patent on it in the 30s. Vogel moved to the USA. He was living in Chicago, and he founded Wilton in 1941. The reason why the company is called Wilton is because it was on the corner of Wilton Avenue and Wrightwood, which is about a mile south of Wrigley Field. So Wilton did not invent the idea of a bullet vise. That concept was brought forth by York. But Wilton is the company who's most widely known for it, and they're the ones who really brought it to market here in the USA. And it's been popular ever since Wilton started in 1941. So let's take a closer look at some of the strong points and some of the weaknesses of this Wilton Bullet vise. So let's talk about some of the strong points of the Wilton Bullet vise, and then we'll talk about some of the drawbacks. The first and most obvious strong point of the Wilton is that it has a fully enclosed design. And that's really wonderful for keeping metal shavings, wood chips, and also the elements out of your lead screw and from contaminating your grease. There's a reason why when you look at any of your utility trucks driving down the street, they have a Wilton Bullet vise strapped to the back of them because it's great at keeping the elements out. And the Wilton has a number of advantages over these other vices, but one advantage it does not have is in overall strength. I would consider this vise to be a light to moderate duty vise, and we're going to get into why here in a minute. But it also has more of a precision feel than most of the other vices here. So let's start with the lead screw, okay? The lead screw on this vise is 7/8 of an inch in diameter, and it has 5 threads per inch.
The Parker, for example, has 4 threads per inch, so the Wilton has a little bit of a finer thread, and that finer thread provides a little bit more feedback to the user when the vise is clamping the load. The movable jaw, if you notice, the Wilton has this round ram. This design is actually cheaper to manufacture. It's not as strong though as the rectangular ram, but it is. You could just turn that on the lathe, which keeps your production costs down. But one thing it does have going for it is, you see how this is keyed right there? Now, if you look at the body of the vise, there's a keyway right there, okay? And when the movable jaw is placed into the body of the vise, there's absolutely no rocking from side to side because of that keyed configuration. So it really has a nice precision feel to it. And the Wilton, if you take a look at the nut on the Wilton, here's the nut. Look at the size of it compared to, that's the Parker, right? They're both 4-inch vises, but you could see the engagement on the nut of the Wilton is considerably more than a lot of the other designs. And the nut on the Wilton feeds into the back of the body like this, okay? And it's held in place with a couple pins. And so once that nut is pinned in there, it's not moving around, you know, there's no slop in it. So Wilton used in their advertisements what they referred to as a straight line pull. And what that means is the lead screw and the nut are in perfect alignment with each other, as opposed to the other vices. Okay, if you look at the way that the nut on the Parker, for example, is held into place, and the other vices are a similar design, it's held in place here at the bottom, and the lead screw rides up here. So what happens is, under a load, this will want to cant forward like that because of physics, okay? So that movement could create a little bit of binding, you know, under a heavy load, whereas the Wilton is not going to have that problem because they're in alignment with each other. So that's definitely a great design, that straight line pull. It's more than just advertising talk. I mean, it really is effective. So anyways, let's take a look at some of the drawbacks of the Wilton. The first drawback on the Wilton vise is that the dynamic jaw is hollow. So one of the jaws on the Wilton is hollow, and this one appears to be solid. Another drawback to the Wilton is the strength of this round ram. This design is not as strong as the rectangular ram like you see on the Reed, and there have been some instances under heavy clamping where this actually started to bend a little bit. So it's an inferior design as far as overall brute strength is concerned, which is why I said the Wilton is really considered to be a light to moderate use, and think of it more as a precision vise rather than a heavy duty type of a vise. Another drawback that the Wilton has is these removable jaws. Most of the time, like a swivel base, this type of jaw design is just a liability. And this, if you look at the jaw right there, you see that pin, it fits in there and held in place with a couple screws. But what would happen is, you know, if you're hitting on this thing, either A, the screw is going to break, or more likely than that, this ledge that holds it up, that's likely to crack off, especially on the dynamic jaw because that jaw is hollow. So that's really not as good of a design as the Reed, which has the forged welded jaws, and those things ain't ever coming out. So the Wilton has this collar right here, which holds the dynamic jaw in place. There's no provision for any type of a thrust washer to take out any backlash or anything like that. And there's no provision for lubrication. On the plus side, because the Wilton is completely enclosed, you won't need to add lubrication nearly as often because it's take a lot longer for the grease to dry out when it's sealed in the way it is on here. So that's not too much of an issue on this bullet vise. So anyways, overall, I like the Wilton. I use it on my own workbench, and I think it's a fantastic vise. If you're looking for something precision, it has great feedback, kind of like if you have a high-end sports car, you know how on a good car, you get that feedback from the steering wheel to the road. That's kind of how the Wilton is. So let's take a look at the Athol-Starrett and see what that vise is all about.
Okay, real quickly before moving on to the Athol vise, I took a second and I reassembled the Wilton, and I just wanted to demonstrate the precision fit of the dynamic jaw against the body of the vise. If I open this up an inch or so and I go to move this, okay, there's absolutely no play in that thing. I mean, it's really a precision fit with that long key running throughout it. So that's really nice. As a matter of fact, if I take this rod right here
and I'm going to deliberately clamp it all the way to the one side, and I go ahead and I tighten that down, okay, there's no give in that. I mean, the jaws stay true because of that keyed alignment, so it's really a great design. One thing that I forgot to mention before that is a slight drawback on the Wilton compared to some of the other vices that we're going to look at is the Wilton does have a little bit less of a depth from the top of the jaw to the ram. This particular vise is about 3¼ inches, and that depth is a little bit less than some of the other vices that we're going to look at. Anyways, I still think that the Wilton is a fantastic vise, and that's the reason why I use it on my own workbench.
All right, so the next vise we're going to take a look at is the Athol-Starrett vise. And there was two companies, Athol Machine Company and the Athol-Starrett Company, and the history of those two companies is intertwined. And the reason that they're intertwined is because a gentleman named Leroy Starrett, he and a group of guys founded the Athol Machine Company with the purpose of producing some of Mr. Starrett's inventions. One of his earliest inventions was actually a meat chopper. Anyways, after some time went by, he had a falling out with those guys, and he broke off and he started his own company, the Athol-Starrett Company, which is still in business. And that company is world renowned for making precision machinist tools. Anyways, after he started his own company, about 20 years later, he ended up buying the remnants of the Athol Machine Company that he had been part of back in the day. And now he had control of both companies. So that's how the history of those companies tie in. Anyways, both of those companies were based in Athol, Massachusetts. So when you look at this vise, it says the Athol-Starrett Company, Athol vise. That's how that fits together. So anyways, we're going to take a look at some of the drawbacks of this vise, and we're going to look at some of its strong points, and I think you're going to be surprised. So let's take a look at the Athol-Starrett vise, and first we'll talk about some of the strong points of this vise. It's important to note that the Starrett vises are widely considered to be some of the finest bench vises ever made, in America. If you go on any machinist forum or anywhere where they're talking about bench vises, these vises have a huge following. They're highly sought after and they're very expensive. So this particular vise is a 925 and it has 5-inch jaws and it weighs about 87 pounds. It does not have a swivel base, but 87 pounds is pretty substantial for a 5-inch vise without a swivel base. So anyways, the first thing that you're going to notice when you put your hands on a Starrett vise is the machining of the castings is extremely well done. Okay, so the dynamic jaw, okay, the way that fits in there, there is a minimum amount of side-to-side movement in here. I mean, it's very, very slight. If I was to put a feeler gauge in there, you might get a couple thou in there, but you're not going to get a lot. So anyways, now it's not as precise as the Wilton. Okay, the Wilton is the best in that regards, but for this square style or rectangular style ram, it's very precise. And this particular vise is almost in new condition. You can see all the original machining marks on it. So this particular vise is really tight anyway, just because it hasn't been used that much. So this jaw has a real nice feel in there. Okay, now I'm going to remove the jaw. The dynamic jaw on this vise weighs 27 pounds. And for comparison, I also put the reed jaw up here so that we can compare and we can contrast them. Okay, but before we do that, let's move on to the body of the vise. Okay, this area here is called the horn. And the horn on the Starrett Athol vises is a little bit longer than on some of the other vises. For example, this thing is probably at least a ½ inch longer than the one on the reed. This particular horn comes out to be 3 3/4 inches away from the body, and it's a substantial build quality, and it's nicely machined right here. It's got these two ways, so that extra long horn, gives some rigidity to the whole thing. When that dynamic jaw is extended, that horn really gives it some strength. So that's a great feature on this. Another nice thing about the Athol-Starrett vises is that the distance between the top of the jaw and the ram, okay, is quite a bit taller than it was on the reed. Matter of fact, I should have measured it when it was in here, but let me put that back in there.
Okay, so that's 5¼ inches tall. Okay, so that's, you have a lot of working room on that with that design. So that's a great strong point on the Starrett, is that you have a lot of working room. If you're working on taller pieces, this vise will really suit you well. So continuing to the back side of the body of the vise, if you look at the areas where the dynamic jaw rides, those little areas that it rides on are nicely machined. If you look at that, you look on this side, I mean the fit and finish on the dynamic jaw as compared to the body, it's really a fantastic job that they did when they machined that. Also back here, you have an anvil area. So for doing light work, it's a pretty good size anvil. It's bigger than the anvils on the other vices. As a matter of fact, the Reed does not have a distinct anvil behind there. I mean, in reality, you're only supposed to be doing very light work back there anyways. But anyways, it does have a small anvil on there and the Reed does not. Another nice thing about this vise is if you look at the thickness of the base, okay, that's a substantial casting right there. So that's what gives it some weight. If you look at the thickness of that base on there, that's almost 1 inch thick. So that area is definitely thicker than the Reed. So, I mean, this is a really nice casting, okay? So now let's move on to the lead screw. The lead screw on the Athol-Starrett is 1 1/8 inches in diameter. And that thickness is thicker than the Reed by 1/8 of an inch. So it really does have a substantial lead screw. And also, and this is a very important feature, is the Athol-Starrett is the only vise on the table here that utilizes a buttress thread. So if you look at that, you can see that those are not the square threads that you find on the other vises. The buttress thread is a very strong thread, and it also gives a precise feel. This particular vise has 5 threads per inch, so when you crank the Starrett vise in and out, it really has a great feel to it as the jaws moving in and out. Take a look at that there. They really did a nice job when they machined this lead screw on the vise. I mean, it's really a beautiful piece of work. Let's do some comparing of the dynamic jaw on the Reed R series versus the Athol-Starrett. One of the first things that immediately jumps out at you when you look at the two of them side by side is you could see that the ram on the Reed vise is considerably more substantial than that of the Athol. So the Athol, the ram is about 2 inches wide, and on the Reed, it's 2 1/4. And the height of the Reed ram is 3 1/2 versus 3 for the Athol. So you got an extra 1/2 inch of material here. So the ram on the Reed vise is definitely beefier than that of the Starrett. I mean, there's no doubt about it. As a matter of fact, when you look at these two movable jaws, the movable jaw of the Starrett weighs 27 pounds and the movable jaw of the Reed weighs 30.2 pounds. So you might ask yourself, why is the Reed so much heavier than the Athol, even though the Athol has taller jaws than the Reed? Well, that's a great question. Let's find out. I went ahead and I flipped the dynamic jaws of both the Reed and the Starrett over so that we could take a better look at them. And the first thing that you're going to notice when you look at the jaw on the Athol as compared to the Reed, you want to see something funny? Boom! What do you notice? The jaws on the Athol are hollow. Okay, so that is why the jaw weighs less than the Reed. The jaw on that, you look down there, it's like an abyss down there. Okay, the thing is completely hollow. So in that regards, the Reed definitely wins for having solid jaws. Also, a quick reminder that the Reed also features these lubrication ports here and here, and the Athol-Starrett does not. So in order to lubricate this vise, you have to take the dynamic jaw completely off, flip it over, lubricate it, put it back together. It's a lot more work. Whereas this one, you could just shoot a little bit of oil into those oil ports. So the reed is better in that regard also. Another thing that we're going to take a look at is the reed has a sacrificial thrust washer that fits in here. So as any backlash develops, or as the vise wears out, you can go ahead and you could replace that sacrificial thrust washer. The Athol does not have any thrust washer here. So when the lead screw rides against here, this is going to be prone to wear. There is no thrust washer. As a matter of fact, when I put this vise back together, I went online and I purchased this little needle bearing right there, okay? That's a thrust needle bearing right there. When I put this vise back together, I'm gonna put it together with my own upgrade, and I'm gonna install that little thrust washer right there with the needle bearings on there to give that a better feel and give a little bit of extra protection. But that is not included with the vise. That's my own upgrade that I'm gonna do to this vise. Let's compare the way that these two bench vises eliminate backlash as it develops in the lead screws. So just as a quick reminder, the Reed R series utilizes this split nut design. And this is really a fantastic design. If any slop, forms in there, you can just adjust this and you can take it out. And don't forget that the Reed also has this sacrificial thrust washer, whereas the Athol does not. Additionally, since the Reed has that lubrication port right there, it's real easy to keep all of this lubricated, so you're not going to have as much wear because you're going to keep it lubricated all the time. As far as the Athol is concerned, they decided to take a cheaper approach to eliminate the backlash. And what they decided to do was they just decided to put this spring in there. So the spring fits over the lead screw like that, and it's held in place with this cotter pin. And the spring just keeps constant pressure on the lead screw here, and that's what takes out any backlash. So the spring is just constantly pulling on it, okay? And this is a cheaper design. It's much more expensive to manufacture this part, okay, and machine that than it is to put a spring on there. The major drawback to this design is that if you look right there, they drilled a hole all the way through the spindle in order to accommodate the cotter pin. That is a huge, huge design flaw. You can't emphasize that enough. As a matter of fact, if you go on YouTube and you watch a guy named Jason from Fireball Tool, he's got a series of videos where he's been testing these bench vises because he's been designing his own bench vise. And his vise, if you have thousands of dollars to spend, is without question the best bench vise on the market. There's no question about it. If you have the ability to pay thousands of dollars, that's the vise you want. But anyways, back to these vintage vises. One of the things that you're going to notice in his videos, when he takes a number of bench vises and he tests them until they actually break, all of the vises that had holes drilled through the spindle broke at that spot. And he said it at least a half a dozen times throughout his videos. It's a huge design flaw to drill a hole through your spindle because that cuts the weakness of that spindle at least in half. I mean, what good is it to have a fat spindle like that if you're going to drill a hole through the middle of it? So that is a big weak point on the Athol right there. Looking at the spindle of the Reed, you can see that there's no hole drilled in it. So that's because Reed spent the extra money to machine the split nut design to take out the backlash. And that definitely costs more money than that spring design. But the plus side of that is that even though the spindle on the Reed is an inch as opposed to 1 1/8 inches, it doesn't have a hole drilled in it. So the overall strength of this spindle is definitely going to be stronger. I have a copy here of the Starrett number 28 catalog, which features the 900 series vices, and it also features some of their utility vices, okay? There's no mention of the material that these vices were cast out of in the Starrett 28 catalog, at least as far as the machinist vices are concerned. If you look over here at the utility vices, it does mention that they were cast out of seasoned cast iron. It does specifically say that right there in the Starrett catalog. And the process of seasoning cast iron is really just the process of leaving the pieces outside after they're cast so that they can freeze and they can thaw and freeze and thaw, and that relieves some of the stresses of the iron after it's cast. But it doesn't even mention that here as far as the machinist vices are concerned. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is if you go online, there's some great forums if you want to learn about bench vices. In particular, a Garage Journal is an excellent forum, and they have tons of information about these vices on there, okay? And anyways, when I was reading about the Starrett vice, somebody had put on there that they thought that the Starrett vices were cast out of malleable iron, and that I guess some of the later castings for Starrett were actually done by Yost. At least that's what I read on there. And they said that Yost took it upon themselves to upgrade the material that they were cast out of because they thought that the original drawings from Starrett were too thin, and you know, they added unicorn piss and fairy dust and all this other stuff. Well, anybody who's ever owned a business or worked around any kind of business people knows that there is no way that a company is going to take it upon themselves to upgrade the material and to go through all this extra steps if they're not getting paid for it. I mean, that's the bottom line. No company is going to do that. At least it doesn't seem realistic to me that they would just take it upon themselves to do that. They're going to make the vise to whatever specifications Starrett outlined when they gave them the drawings for the vise, and that's the end of that. Also, if it was made out of some kind of a special material, Starrett would surely have advertised that in their catalog. They would have mentioned it because they went through the trouble of mentioning the seasoned cast iron on the utility vices. So certainly they would have mentioned it there, especially given the prices for those vices. So anyways, we're not going to make any assumptions that these vices were cast out of anything other than regular cast iron because there's no factual basis for that claim.
Looking at the jaw design on the Athol-Starrett, we could see that these jaws are designed to be removable. This design is similar to the Wilton in that the jaws are just supported by this little ledge right here. This little ledge is a little bit thin, and because these jaws are hollow, this would definitely be more prone to breaking. Also, this is machined completely square, so it would actually be stronger if there was a little bit of a radius in here because this would be more prone to stress fractures right there. So anyways, this just sits up here like that, just held in place with a couple bolts. So this design is definitely not as good as the Parker or as the Reed.
Okay, so we're going to look at the nut and we're going to look at the housing where it resides on the Athol-Starrett. The first thing that we can see right off the bat is that this area is not machined. It's just a rough casting in there. The second thing that we're going to notice, and this is a design flaw really, is the back end here is higher than the rest of the inside of the housing area. So what that means is when you put the nut in there, the nut is not sitting level because the back end of the nut is sitting higher than the front. So when I put this in here, okay, the nut is going to be tilted forward because of that ledge. Okay, another thing that we're going to notice on this design right here is look at the slop on that. I mean, that is absolutely unexcusable. So they really did a poor job of machining that. When you consider the body of the vise and how nicely that's machined, it's a big disappointment to see that the fit and finish on this nut is so poor, coupled with the fact that this nut is just made out of cast iron, unlike the Reed. That's really unexcusable. Now, of course, in this design, you have the spring on the lead screw, which is keeping constant pressure on that nut. But anyways, that design with the spring does not mitigate the fact that they did a poor job of machining the nut and the housing on there.
So looking at the three vices that utilize this type of nut design side by side, we can quickly see that by far the Reed is the best design. This is fully machined inside of here. This is a close tolerance fit. I mean, there's very little movement in there, and I don't have that locked down, coupled with the fact that that's made out of steel and not out of cast iron. The Charles Parker is also an excellent fit. Okay, you look at that Charles Parker, there's no movement of that nut. Now, the Charles Parker is also held in place with a little pin similar to the Athol, but the fit and finish on that Charles Parker is much better than the Starrett. Now here, once again, we go back over to the Starrett, and you can see that that is a poor fit and finish in there. So anyways, let's continue on. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about the Charles Parker. This particular vise is a 4-inch vise, by the way. The Charles Parker Company was founded in 1832 by its namesake, Charles Parker, and they were in business for about 125 years until 1957 when they were sold to Union. At least Union bought their name, and then they were sold a couple times after that. But anyways, this company manufactured a lot of different products over the years that they were in business. They manufactured piano stools, curtain rods, eyeglasses, and more famously, they were known for making high-quality shotguns. The Charles Parker vises are considered to be some of the finest vises that were ever produced in this country. And I think after this video is over, I will be retracting my statement that I made about the top 3 vises being Reed, Wilton, and Athol, and we are going to replace the Athol with the Charles Parker. I feel that after looking at these vises broken down, I made a big mistake when I jumped to that conclusion prior to doing all the testing and inspecting that I'm doing now. So we're going to take a look at this Charles Parker, and I'm going to tell you why I came to that conclusion. So the vise we're looking at here is a number 2, and they started manufacturing this vise in the mid-1860s. And originally, when they first came out, they had the patent dates down here, and then about 20 years later, the patent dates disappeared here. So this particular vise was manufactured in about 1898, which makes it 125 years old. So it's by far the oldest vise that we have in the group here. So anyways, let's take a look at the design of it. So the first thing we're going to notice about the Charles Parker is that the jaws on the Charles Parker are solid all the way through. So it's a nice, strong design. This is a 4-inch vise, so of course it's not going to weigh as much as the Athol or the Reed. Another important advantage that the Charles Parker has compared to the Athol and the Wilton is that this vise does have removable jaws. But if you're going to have removable jaws on a vise, this is the engineering that you want. So these jaws, if you look at the design of this jaw, first you can see it extends all the way back here. So you got some nice steel surfaces to work on if you need to. But more importantly, this is pinned in back here, okay? So you don't have to worry about the bolts that are holding it breaking off, and you don't have to worry about that weak ledge snapping off with this design. So this design on the Charles Parker is an excellent design for removable jaws. So let's take a look at the dynamic jaw on the Parker. And this is really a well-engineered dynamic jaw. It's actually much better engineered than the Athol, the Hollands, and the Colombian that we looked at earlier. One thing we're going to notice right off the bat is there's no opening here. And the reason for that is because this design utilizes a yoke. Okay, so this collar right here fits here, and that secures the lead screw into position without the need for an opening here. So that really adds a lot of mass to the jaw here, so that's solid all the way through. Okay. Another thing that we're going to notice about the Parker design is that the Parker does have a sacrificial thrust washer, so as that wears out, you can replace that thrust washer. The Parker also has a design for eliminating the backlash, at least this vise does, and it has a spring. But the nice thing about this spring design, as opposed to the Starrett, is they designed this spring without necessitating a hole going through the spindle. So in the Parker, the spring goes through back here, okay? And when the lead screw goes through, the spring is just riding up against the nut. So that's a great design because you have the benefit of taking the slop out of the lead screw, but you don't have to sacrifice the strength of your spindle in order to do it. So this is really a fantastic design. The lead screw on the Parker has 4 threads per inch, which is a little bit coarser than the other vices we looked at. One feature that is unique on the Parker compared to any other vise that we've looked at so far is if you look here on the handle, you see that little dimple right there? The reason why that's there is to accommodate a set screw, which will lock the handle into position so it's not sliding around as you're tightening up the vise. Now, it's important to remember that this vise is 125 years old, and it's been used for the 125 years, so it does have a little bit of wear on it. But in spite of that, the fit on the dynamic jaw into the body is pretty good on this vise. I mean, yeah, there is a little bit of play in there, okay, but it's not bad. I mean, that is definitely acceptable, especially when you consider the age of this vise. So that's pretty impressive. Now we're looking at the underside of the Charles Parker. And one of the major drawbacks to Parkers is this wedge design. If you look here, you can see this wedge. It moves at about a 45-degree angle relative to the base. And in order to mount this vise, okay, if I take this body and I flip it over, okay, see how that's tilted like that? The only way that you can mount that on your bench is you need to cut a notch in your workbench to accommodate this wedge. And that is a terrible design. I mean, nobody that has a nice workbench wants to cut a notch out of it. And if you have a steel workbench or something like that, you know, it becomes that much more difficult to accommodate this vise. So the only workaround that's practical is you would have to build a wooden spacer and cut the spacer out and then mount the spacer to the bench and mount the vise to the spacer. The drawback to doing that is that if you add the spacer into the mix, now it's not going to be nearly as rigid because you have an extra piece of material in there, and the whole thing is going to lose a lot of strength. So I've had this Parker vise for a long time, and I've never mounted it to a workbench, and that's the primary reason why. Is this is a terrible design right here. So anyways, but that's the way a lot of those were made, and if you want to mount a Parker vise, that's one of the drawbacks you're going to have to work around. So the last couple things we'll mention about the Parker is that the height from the top of the jaw to the ram is about 3 3/4 inches, which is pretty respectable for a 4-inch vise. That's about the same as the Reed, actually. And another thing that we'll notice is that the Parker does not have any provision for lubrication. So in order to lubricate it, you have to take it completely apart, which is definitely kind of a hassle. So now I'm going to go ahead and going to get these vises put back together, and we'll get ready to close this video out. So as we get ready to close out this video, I will point out that disassembling and reassembling the Athol style vises with that compressed spring and the cotter pin is definitely more of a hassle than the other vises. That spring is fairly heavy and you don't have a lot of room to work in that little opening in the dynamic jaw. So under normal circumstances, you're going to have to take a piece of pipe or something like that, and you're going to have to compress it from the back side, hold it in the compressed position, and drop that cotter pin in there to secure it. And it's the same thing if you have to take it apart for any reason. And that is definitely a lot more of a hassle than any of the other vices. That being said, making this video was really an eye-opener for me. And I think I suffered from a little bit of confirmation bias when I placed this Athol-Starrett vise so highly. You know, when I got it, I was so proud to have it, and it's so well regarded that I think I just kind of followed the herd mentality, and I quickly placed that as my number 3 pick, when in reality I should have done my due diligence and taken them apart like I just did. And I was kind of shocked really to see how well the Charles Parker did. And you know, a man has to admit when he's wrong. And in that case, I'll have to say that the Charles Parker was definitely better than the Athol-Starrett, you know, in its overall design. Yeah, it's a little bit of a hassle to mount that thing with that wedge. You know, it's not perfect, but I would say that overall it is better than the Athol-Starrett. That being said, there could only be one vise at the top of the heap in this video. And without a question, that vise is the Reed R Series. Okay, we looked at a bunch of different vises, and there's no question that overall the Reed R Series is the best bench vise you can get of the vintage American-made bench vises for general purpose use. I mean, between the construction of the jaws, the solid body, the ability to take out the backlash, the ability to lubricate the vise without disassembling it, the overall stoutness of the vise, I mean, it's a fantastic vise, and there's no way that you're going to buy a Reed R Series vise and you're going to be disappointed with it. It's just not going to happen. I mean, it's really a fantastic vise, and without question, it was better than any of the other vices we looked at in this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was certainly fun for me and certainly an eye-opener, and I'm looking forward to making the next video. and we'll see you guys soon. Thank you very much for watching.